Animal Farm, Chapter 3. How they toiled or worked and sweated to get that hay in. But their efforts were rewarded, for the harvest was an even bigger success than they had hoped. Sometimes the work was hard. The implements or tools had been designed for human beings and not for animals. And it was a great drawback or kind of obstacle that no animal was able to use any tool that involved standing on his hind legs. But the pigs were so clever that they could think of a way around every difficulty. As for the horses, they knew every inch of the field, and in fact understood the business of mowing and raking far better than Jones and his men had ever done. The pigs did not actually work, but directed and supervised the others. With their superior knowledge, it was natural that they should assume the leadership. Boxer and Clover would harness themselves to the cutter or the horse rake. No bits or reins were needed in these days, of course, and tramp steadily round and round the field, with a pig walking behind and calling out, "Yep, comrade," or "Whoa back, comrade," as the case may be. And every animal, down to the humblest or the smallest, worked at turning the hay and gathering it. Even the ducks and hens toiled to and fro or back and forth all day in the sun, carrying tiny wisps of hay in their beaks. In the end, they finished the harvest in 2 days less time than it had usually taken Jones and his men. Moreover, it was the biggest harvest that the farm had ever seen. There was no wastage whatever. The hens and ducks with their sharp eyes had gathered up the very last stalk, and not an animal on the farm had stolen so much as a mouthful. Let's take a moment and visualize some of this. So what we're talking about the horses pulling would be a hay cutter, which would be basically a lawnmower, and then a hay rake. So again, hay is just lengthy grass that gets dried out. So you have to cut it, and then you rake it, and then you put it into those bales that we had seen in the previous videos. So they had a huge harvest. Nobody had stolen so much as a mouthful. All through that summer, the work on the farm went like clockwork. The animals were happy as they had never conceived it possible to be. Every mouthful of food was an acute, positive pleasure, now that it was truly their own food, produced by themselves and for themselves, not doled or given out to them by a grudging master. With the worthless, parasitical human beings gone, there was more for everyone to eat. There was more leisure or relaxation, too, inexperienced though the animals were. They met with many difficulties. For instance, later in the year, when they harvested the corn, they had to tread it out in the ancient style and blow away the chaff with their breath, since the farm possessed no threshing machine. But the pigs with their cleverness and Boxer with his tremendous muscles always pulled them through. Boxer was the admiration of everybody. He had been a hard worker even in Jones's time, but now he seemed more like 3 horses than 1. There were days when the entire work of the farm seemed to rest on his mighty shoulders. From morning to night, he was pushing and pulling, always at the spot where the work was hardest. He had made an arrangement with one of the cockerels or roosters to call him in the mornings half an hour earlier than anyone else, and would put in some volunteer labor at whatever seemed to be most needed, before the regular day's work began. His answer to every problem, every setback, was, "I will work harder," which he had adopted as his personal motto. Now, we've got a couple things that you might be unfamiliar with. First and foremost, this information about Boxer, that would be a valuable entry into your character tracker. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please go back and watch the sub-plan video for Tuesday, February 12th. Otherwise, character tracker, make sure you're adding this information about Boxer, especially that personal motto, especially getting up extra early, all that stuff. Additionally, talking about the corn and treading it out and blowing away the chaff, I actually found some videos online about what that looks like. I'm going to encourage you to do this on your own, but essentially what you're doing is going to be removing the good edible food parts from the trash stuff. So if you imagine a corn cob, elote, right? You've got the delicious kernels that you want to eat off, And then you've got the cob, which ends up being trash. Now, what they would do is they would dry these things out, and then they would be able to store them and maybe rehydrate them later. But they still couldn't eat the cob, so they had to devise different ways to make that happen without being able to use these machines. Personal motto of Boxer, I will work harder. But everyone worked according to his capacity or ability. The hens and ducks, for instance, saved 5 bushels of corn at the harvest by gathering up the stray grains. Now, a bushel would be a large basket, almost the size of like the storage crates that I keep the computers in the classroom. So a lot of this, there's a lot of work that those hens and ducks are doing, gathering up 1 and 2 corn grains at a time. Wow, tiny amounts gathered up a lot to make a big amount. Nobody stole, nobody grumbled or complained over his rations. The quarreling or fighting and biting and jealousy, which had been normal features of life in the old days, had almost disappeared. Nobody shirked. Shirked means trying to avoid work. Nobody shirked, or almost nobody. Molly, it was true, was not good at getting up in the mornings, and had a way of leaving work early on the ground or on the excuse that there was a stone in her hoof. And the behavior of the cat was somewhat peculiar or strange. It was soon noticed that when there was work to be done, the cat could never be found. She would vanish for hours on end, and then reappear at meal times or in the evening after work was over, as though nothing had happened. But she always made such excellent excuses and purred so affectionately that it was impossible not to believe in her good intentions. Old Benjamin the donkey seemed quite unchanged since the rebellion. He did his work in the same slow, obstinate, or stubborn way as he had done it in Jones's time, never shirking and never volunteering for extra work either. About the rebellion and its results, he would express no opinion. When asked whether he was not happier now that Jones was gone, he would say only, "Donkeys live a long time. None of you has ever seen a dead donkey." And the others had to be content or satisfied with this cryptic or kind of secretive answer. Now would be a really great time to pause the video and add some of these details to your character tracker. You learned a lot about Molly, some about the cat. The cat does not become a very, very important character, so gather those details, but don't give it a ton of space. Benjamin also is pretty important, so definitely be gathering details on him. On Sundays, there was no work. Breakfast was a half hour later than usual, and after breakfast there was a ceremony which was observed every week without fail. First came the hoisting or raising of the flag. Snowball had found in the harness room an old green tablecloth of Mrs. Jones's and had painted on it a hoof and a horn in white. This was run up the flagstaff in the farmhouse garden every Sunday morning, ignore that 8. The flag was green, Snowball explained, to represent the green fields of England, while the hoof and horn signified the future republic of the animals which would arise when the human race had been finally overthrown. After the hoisting of the flag, all the animals trooped into the big barn for a general assembly or meeting, which was known as, the meeting. Here the work of the coming week was planned out and resolutions were put forward and debated. Now this seems like resolutions in the sense that you learned in history class, like solutions to potential problems, which were suggested or put forward and then debated. It was always the pigs who put forward the resolutions. The other animals understood how to vote, but could never think of any resolutions of their own. Snowball and Napoleon were by far the most active in the debates. But it was noticed that these two were never in agreement. Whatever suggestion either of them made, the other could be counted on to oppose it. Even when it was resolved, a thing no one could object to in itself, to set aside the small paddock behind the orchard as a home of rest for animals who were past work as kind of a retirement space. There was a stormy debate over the correct retiring age for each class of animal. The meeting always ended with the singing of Beasts of England, and the afternoon was given up to recreation, or kind of playtime. Please make sure to gather these details about Snowball and Napoleon. This stuff is important. Them not getting along becomes a super big deal. Before we do move on, I found a great picture online of the Animal Farm flag. or what a representation of it might be, like a hoof for an animal and a horn. And the reason that the artist created it like this is so that it would resemble the Soviet flag. If you haven't figured out what the Soviet Union is yet, you might flip back to page 68 in your notebook and read that bit about the Russian Revolution. Either way, let's keep going. The pigs had set aside the harness room as a headquarters for themselves, maybe as kind of an office. Here in the evenings, they studied blacksmithing, which is the use of tools to make metal, other tools, like you would sharpen a knife that way, you could create like a plow that way. Carpentering, which is building housing, and think of how they would need that to, make sure that they keep the farm up to snuff. They would have to repair things over time, the buildings, that is. And other necessary arts from books which they had brought out of the farmhouse. Snowball also busied himself with organizing the other animals into what he called animal committees. He was indefatigable at this. What a word, indefatigable. That means, let's take a look at this. In means not. D is related to fatiguing. So it means like of fatigue. Fatigue is tiredness. So he was not fatigued, basically. So basically he was tireless. He could do this all day, every day, forever. He formed the Egg Production Committee for the hens, the Clean Tails League for the cows, the Wild Comrades Re-Education Committee. The object of this was to tame the rats and rabbits, the Whiter Wool Movement for the sheep, and various others, besides instituting classes in reading and writing. On the whole, these projects were a failure. The attempt to tame the wild creatures, for instance, broke down almost immediately. They continued to behave very much as before, and when treated with generosity, simply took advantage of it. The cat joined the Re-Education Committee and was very active in it for some days. She was seen one day sitting on a roof and talking to some sparrows or little birds who were just out of her reach. She was telling them that all animals were now comrades, and that any sparrow who chose could come and perch on her paw. But the sparrows kept their distance. Think about what that cat is trying to do. Think about why the sparrows might not want to go over to that cat. The reading and writing classes, however, were a great success. By the autumn, almost every animal on the farm was literate in some degree. Now, if you think about the setting, this is the autumn now. The beginning of the rebellion was on June 21st. So it's been about 3 months, and every animal on the farm was able to read or write at least a little bit. As for the pigs, they could already read and write perfectly. The dogs learned to read fairly well, but were not interested in reading anything except the 7 Commandments. Muriel the goat could read somewhat better than the dogs, and sometimes used to read to the others in the evenings from scraps of newspaper which she found on the rubbish heap. Benjamin could read as well as any pig, but never exercised his faculty. He chose not to do it. So far as he knew, he said, there was nothing worth reading. Dang, his cynicism. He's so cynical. Wow, he's really a little extra. Clover learned the whole alphabet, but could not put words together. Boxer could not get beyond the letter D. He would trace out A, B, C, D in the dust with his great hoof, and then would stand staring at the letters with his ears back, sometimes shaking his forelock, his forehead, trying with all his might to remember what came next, and never succeeding. On several occasions, indeed, he did learn E, F, G, H, but by the time he knew them, it was always discovered that he had forgotten A, B, C, and D. Finally, he decided to be content with the first 4 letters and used to write them out once or twice every day to refresh his memory. Molly refused to learn any but the 6 letters which spelt her own name. She would form these very neatly out of pieces of twig and would then decorate them with a flower or two and walk round them admiring them. Boy, Molly is something else, isn't she? None of the other animals on the farm could get further than the letter A. It was also found that the stupider animals, such as the sheep, hens, and ducks, were unable to learn the 7 Commandments by heart. Do not forget this. Wink. After much thought, Snowball declared that the 7 Commandments could in effect be reduced to a single maxim, namely, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. This, he said, contained the essential principle of animalism. Whoever had thoroughly grasped it would be safe from human influences. The birds at first objected, since it seemed to them that they also had 2 legs, but Snowball proved to them that this was not so. A bird's wing, comrades, he said, is an organ of propulsion and not of manipulation. Take a look at this. You don't know these words, propulsion and manipulation. Propulsion means to move forward, but manipulation, take a look at these first 3 letters. Spanish speakers, this should remind you of your hand, of manos. It's because they have the same root word. Manos in Latin means hand. So basically, manipulation is hand use. And when you manipulate a person, it's a metaphorical sense. It's basically as if you were using your hand to turn their mind a certain way. So anyway, the bird's wing, comrades, is an organ of propulsion, of like moving forward and not of hands, right? It should therefore be regarded as a leg. The distinguishing mark of man is the hand, the instrument with which he does all his mischief. The birds did not understand Snowball's long words, but they accepted his explanation, and all the humbler animals set to work to learn the new maxim by heart. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, was inscribed or written on the end wall of the barn above the 7 commandments and in bigger letters. When they had once got it by heart, the sheep developed a great liking for this maxim, and often as they lay in the field, they would all start bleating, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and keep it up for hours on end, never growing tired of it. Napoleon took no interest in Snowball's committees. He said that the education of the young was more important than anything that could be done for those who were already grown up. It happened that Jessie and Bluebell, the dogs, remember, had both whelped or given birth soon after the hay harvest, giving birth between them to 9 sturdy puppies. As soon as they were weaned, as soon as they didn't need breast milk anymore, Napoleon took them away from their mothers, saying that he would make himself responsible for their education. He took them up into a loft, which could only be reached by a ladder from the harness room, and there kept them in such seclusion or privacy away from the rest that the rest of the farm soon forgot their existence. There's definitely some stuff worth putting in your character tracker. I would add especially stuff about these sheep and especially what Napoleon is up to. The mystery of where the milk went to was soon cleared up. Remember, as part of the end of chapter 1, was it chapter 1, where it asked about the milk? I'm sorry, it's the end of chapter 2. What happens to the milk? And you needed to make a prediction for your questions. Now we have the answer to that. So if you did not yet answer that question, pause the video right this second and go back and answer that question. Make a prediction. Okay? I want you to actually be making these predictions before you find out. It's really important to be able to evaluate how things have changed from the conditions when you learned of that original prediction. Okay. So if you went back and answered that question, hi, welcome back. If you didn't, hey, here's what happened. It was mixed every day into the pigs' mash. That's their food. The early apples were now ripening, and the grass of the orchard was littered with windfalls. Windfalls are the apples that the wind causes to fall from the tree. Usually these apples do not make their way into the supermarket because they can rot on the ground really quickly, or they might have fallen down because they weren't in great shape to begin with. But animals have the digestive fortitude to handle this. So anyway, the grass of the orchard was littered with these windfalls, right? Beautiful snacks waiting for the animals. The animals had assumed, as a matter of course, that these would be shared out equally. One day, however, the order went forth that all the windfalls were to be collected and brought to the harness room for the use of the pigs. At this, some of the other animals murmured, kind of whispered a little bit, but it was no use. All the pigs were in full agreement on this point, even Snowball and Napoleon. Squealer, remember Squealer is able to turn black into white. Make sure that you've got some notes about Squealer in your character tracker. Squealer was sent to make the necessary explanations to the others. "Comrades!" he cried. Remember, he has a very high-pitched voice. "You do not imagine, I hope, that we pigs are doing this in a spirit of selfishness and privilege. Many of us actually dislike milk and apples. I dislike them myself. Our sole object in taking these things is to preserve our health. Milk and apples, this has been proved by science, comrades, contain substances absolutely necessary to the well-being of a pig. We pigs are brain workers. The whole management and organization of the farm depend on us. Day and night, we are watching over your welfare. It is for your sake that we drink that milk and eat those apples. Do you know what would happen if we pigs failed in our duty? Jones would come back. Yes, Jones would come back. Surely, comrades, cried Squealer almost pleadingly, skipping from side to side and whisking his tail. Surely there is no one among you who wants to see Jones come back. Now, if there was one thing that the animals were completely certain of, it was that they did not want Jones back. When it was put to them in this light, they had no more to say. The importance of keeping the pigs in good health was all too obvious. So it was agreed, without further argument, that the milk and the windfall apples, and also the main crop of apples when they ripened, should be reserved for the pigs alone. That's the end of chapter 3. I want you to really think about how this is going so far. Can't wait to see your responses.